I hadn't heard my mother's voice in 9 years. Not a call, not a text, not so much as a birthday card slipped quietly into the mail. So when I opened my front door on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon and found her standing there, I genuinely thought I was imagining it. She looked exactly the way I remembered, hair done, blouse pressed, posture perfect, like she was walking into church rather than the daughter she'd erased. There was no hesitation in her face. No flicker of guilt. She held a manila folder against her chest like a shield, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. I braced myself for an apology. 9 years of silence deserved at least that much. I waited for her to ask about my husband or my children, the grandchildren she'd never met, never acknowledged, never once mentioned in 9 years of nothing. I waited for some small crack in that composed exterior. It never came. Instead, she said my name the way she used to when I was a teenager who disappointed her, clipped businesslike, already annoyed that she had to be there at all. Then she held out the folder like it was the most natural thing in the world, like no time had passed, like nothing had ever happened between us. She wasn't there to reconnect. She wasn't there to make amends. She wanted something. And the strange thing was, in that first frozen second on my doorstep, I already knew whatever was in that folder was going to explain a lot more than just why she'd shown up. It was going to explain why she'd left. Instead, she said my name the way she used to when I was a teenager who disappointed her, clipped businesslike, already annoyed that she had to be there at all. Then she held out the folder like it was the most natural thing in the world, like no time had passed, like nothing had ever happened between us. She wasn't there to reconnect. She wasn't there to make amends. She wanted something. And the strange thing was, in that first frozen second on my doorstep, I already knew whatever was in that folder was going to explain a lot more than just why she'd shown up. It was going to explain why she'd left. I thought it was a threat born of shock, something they'd walk back once they saw how happy I was. They didn't. On my wedding day, their seats sat empty, along with most of my extended family, quietly pressured to stay away out of loyalty. Only my husband's family, one loyal cousin, and my closest friend stood beside me. What followed was 9 years of nothing. No calls when I got pregnant. No acknowledgement when my children were born. 2 birthdays a year times 9 passed without a single card. I built an entire life, a marriage, a home. 2 children who didn't know their grandmother's face, completely outside the family had grown up in. For years I told myself it was about tradition, about what they thought was acceptable. But the real reason they cut me off had very little to do with tradition at all. To understand what was really driving my parents, we need to look further back, long before I ever brought him home. Growing up, love in my family was never unconditional. It was a reward handed out carefully based on how well you performed the role they'd assigned you. My younger sister understood that role instinctively. She married young to a man from a good family, someone my parents had practically handpicked, someone who checked every box on their unspoken list. Her wedding was the kind of event my parents had always dreamed of throwing. The right venue, the right guest list, the right photographs for the mantle. She was praised, constantly held up at every family gathering as proof that they'd raised their children correctly. I was never quite as easy to hold up. I asked questions. I made my own decisions even when they disagreed. I moved out earlier than they wanted, chose a career they didn't fully understand, and never seemed to need their approval quite as much as they expected me to. My parents cared deeply about how our family appeared to the outside world. Respectability wasn't just a value in our house. It was the value, the thing everything else was measured against. As long as we performed the version of the family, they wanted people to see we were rewarded with warmth. The moment any of us stepped outside that image, the warmth disappeared, replaced by a distance that felt engineered rather than emotional. What I didn't realize was that my exile wasn't really about my husband at all. It was about a lifelong pattern finally reaching its breaking point the moment my independence became too visible, too permanent, too impossible for them to quietly manage or explain away to people whose opinions mattered more to them than my happiness did. My sister had given them the image they wanted. I had in their eyes threatened it. And once that line was drawn, there was no version of my life they were willing to accept, no matter how happy I actually was. That pattern, the image obsession, the conditional love, the quiet punishment for stepping out of line is exactly what resurfaced the moment my mother appeared at my door, folder in hand, acting as though 9 years hadn't happened at all. I let her in. 9 years of silence, and still some part of me wanted to know what could possibly bring her back. We sat in my living room, the same room she'd never seen in the house she'd never once visited, and she set the folder on the coffee table between us, like it was a peace offering instead of what it actually was. She started soft. That was the first thing I noticed, how carefully she'd rehearsed this. She talked about how much time had passed, how life gets away from you, how families go through seasons. She never said the word sorry. Not once. Instead, she spoke in vague, sweeping terms about how hard things had been for her, as though 9 years of silence was something that had happened to her, rather than something she had chosen and enforced. Then she opened the folder. Inside were documents, financial statements, a loan application papers with my sister's name on them. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. My sister's marriage, the one my parents had once held up as proof they'd raised their children correctly, had quietly fallen apart behind the polished image they'd maintained for years. Her husband's business had failed. There were debts my parents had already sunk their savings into trying to cover, and it still wasn't enough. Now they needed a co-signer for a loan large enough to keep everything from collapsing publicly. They needed someone with stable credit, a stable income, a stable life. They needed me. My mother didn't ask directly at first. She circled it the way she always used to when I was young, and she wanted something without having to be accountable for asking. She talked about family loyalty. She reminded me that blood was blood, that whatever had happened between us, this was about my sister, about the children, about not letting pride destroy a family that had already been through so much. I sat there listening, waiting for her to acknowledge the 9 years. Waiting for her to acknowledge the wedding, the empty seats, the birthdays and births that had passed without a word. She never did. In her mind, apparently none of that required an apology. It required my cooperation now that it was convenient. That was the moment something in me went very quiet and very clear. She hadn't come because she missed me. She hadn't come because she wanted to know her grandchildren or meet the husband she'd spent 9 years pretending didn't exist. She'd come because the child they'd chosen over me, the one who'd given them the image they wanted, had failed to give them the outcome they needed, and I was the only person left who could fix it. I asked her carefully, why now? Why me? She said without a hint of self-awareness that I was the responsible one, that it always landed on my feet, that surely I could understand how important it was to help family in a crisis. I almost laughed. 9 years ago, I was the shame of the family, the daughter who'd embarrassed them, whose wedding they couldn't be seen attending. Now suddenly I was reliable. Suddenly I was family again, but only in the ways that were useful to them. She didn't come back for me. She came back for what I could give her. I looked at the folder, at my sister's name printed across the top of a loan application, at my mother's carefully composed face, waiting for me to say yes, the way I always used to when I was young and desperate for her approval. And I understood with a clarity that almost felt like relief that nothing about this visit had anything to do with reconciliation. It was a transaction. It had always been a transaction, with her love traded for compliance, warmth traded for obedience, and I had simply been outside its terms for the last 9 years. Once I understood why she'd really come, everything about my family's silence made a different kind of sense. It hadn't been about tradition or shame or protecting some fragile image of respectability. It had been about control, and the moment they needed something only I could give, that control came looking for me again, dressed up as family, carrying my sister's name in a folder, like a debt I was somehow supposed to already owe. After she left, I sat with the folder still on my coffee table, and I felt something shift inside me that I hadn't expected. It wasn't rage exactly. It was reorientation, like a photograph I'd been staring at for 9 years had suddenly been turned right side up. I had spent almost a decade believing on some quiet level that I was the reason my family fell apart. That my choices had been too disruptive, too embarrassing for people who valued appearances above almost everything else. I had absorbed their silence as a verdict on my character. But sitting there with the truth in front of me, I understood that none of it had ever been about principle. It had been about convenience. They hadn't cut me off because I'd done something wrong. They'd cut me off because at the time I wasn't useful to the image they were protecting. And now that I was, the silence could simply be set aside as if it had never mattered at all. Only now, with something to gain, had that silence finally cracked. I could already feel the pull of old patterns creeping back in the instinct to smooth things over, to be the reasonable one, to accept a version of peace that cost me everything and them nothing. My mother hadn't apologized, I hadn't asked about my children, hadn't acknowledged the wedding at all. And yet some old tired part of me still felt the familiar tug of guilt whispering that maybe I owed them this, that maybe helping now could undo years of hurt. But the more I sat with it, the clearer things became. Their rejection had never been justified. It had been a choice made deliberately and maintained deliberately for 9 long years, and now they wanted me to act as though none of it had happened simply because they needed something only I could give. That realization was sharp, almost freeing. But the hardest part wasn't the discovery, it was deciding what to do with it. That decision is where the story reaches its turning point. Only now, with something to gain, had that silence finally cracked. I could already feel the pull of old patterns creeping back in the instinct to smooth things over, to be the reasonable one, to accept a version of peace that cost me everything and them nothing. My mother hadn't apologized, I hadn't asked about my children, hadn't acknowledged the wedding at all. And yet some old tired part of me still felt the familiar tug of guilt whispering that maybe I owed them this, that maybe helping now could undo years of hurt. But the more I sat with it, the clearer things became. Their rejection had never been justified. It had been a choice made deliberately and maintained deliberately for 9 long years, and now they wanted me to act as though none of it had happened simply because they needed something only I could give. That realization was sharp, almost freeing. But the hardest part wasn't the discovery, it was deciding what to do with it. That decision is where the story reaches its turning point. Only now, with something to gain, had that silence finally cracked. I could already feel the pull of old patterns creeping back in the instinct to smooth things over, to be the reasonable one, to accept a version of peace that cost me everything and them nothing. My mother hadn't apologized, hadn't asked about my children, hadn't acknowledged the wedding at all. And yet, some old tired part of me still felt the familiar tug of guilt, whispering that maybe I owed them this, that maybe helping now could undo years of hurt. But the more I sat with it, the clearer things became. Their rejection had never been justified. It had been a choice made deliberately and maintained deliberately for 9 long years, and now they wanted me to act as though none of it had happened simply because they needed something only I could give. That realization was sharp, almost freeing. But the hardest part wasn't the discovery, it was deciding what to do with it. That decision is where the story reaches its turning point. The second path was silence. I could simply say no, close the door, and let 9 years become 10, then 20, protecting my peace by removing myself entirely from their reach. There was a certain safety in that option. No confrontation, no risk of reopening wounds, it only just made sense of. But it felt incomplete, like walking away from a conversation that deserved to actually happen. So I chose the third path. I called my mother and asked her to meet me, not to give her an answer about the loan, but to finally say the things 9 years of silence had never allowed either of us to say. I told her calmly that I understood now why they'd cut me off, not because of tradition, not because of my husband, but because I'd stopped fitting into the image they needed the family to project. I told her I understood too why she'd come back, not out of love, but out of necessity, because the version of the family they'd built without me had finally failed to hold itself together. I wasn't cruel. I didn't raise my voice. I simply laid the truth between us the way she had once laid that folder on my coffee table and let her sit with it. I expected defensiveness. What I got was worse. She looked at me unbothered and said that I was choosing to be difficult again, that this was exactly the kind of stubbornness that had caused problems in the first place, that families were supposed to help each other regardless of old disagreements. She still wouldn't say sorry. Even then, faced with everything laid plainly in front of her, she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge what they'd done. What she said next confirmed everything I already knew. There would be no accountability, no real reckoning, only the expectation that I quietly resume my role whenever it served them. I told her gently but firmly that I wouldn't be signing anything and that I wouldn't be available the next time convenience came looking for me either. That conversation became the moment everything between us finally changed for good. I haven't heard from my mother since that conversation. No follow-up call, no second attempt, no softened version of the request it already refused. In a strange way, that silence told me more than words ever could have. It confirmed that everything she'd offered that day at my door had never been about me at all, and once I stopped being useful, there was nothing left to say. I won't pretend there isn't grief in that. Some part of me will always wonder what it would have felt like to have parents who chose me the way I once hoped they would. But I've stopped waiting for an apology that was never going to come, and I've stopped mistaking their silence for something I caused. What I have instead is a life they never got to touch, 9 years of it built quietly and deliberately with people who chose me without conditions. A husband who never once made me question my worth. 2 children who are growing up surrounded by real uncomplicated love, even if it doesn't come from the family I was born into. Closing that door didn't feel like losing something. It felt like finally setting something down I'd been carrying far too long. My family spent 9 years deciding I wasn't worth acknowledging unless I could be useful to them. I've spent those same 9 years building something they'll never fully understand, not out of spite, but out of peace. They spent 9 years erasing me. It took 9 minutes for me to finally let them go.